Hello, my name is Crystal Solomon Salim, and I'm an international educational consultant that works with schools and organizations to support their journey towards greater inclusion. I look forward to speaking with you today and engaging with you and hopefully answering some questions to support your school and your journey in the work that you're doing for this Middle East Educational Teaching and Learning Conference. So our talk today will really focus on what are some of the ways that we can be supporting all of our learners in the classroom. But before we get into that, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about myself and my own journey. I'm a dedicated and passionate educator and have been working in the field for over 20 years. 15 of those years have been within international schools across the world. And in that journey, it's been an amazing opportunity to see schools who were well on their way and others that were just at the beginning of their journey. Prior to that, I was able to study in the US as an educator with a focus on special education, and then moving on into my master's in educational psychology. And I knew that with that information, it was really important for me to understand even further the science behind understanding how we learn and why we learn the way that we do. So continuing my education with Johns Hopkins University and getting to understand some of the neuroscience that sits behind how our learners work, as well as educators and how we interact with our students. And ultimately, that's led me to where we are today, where I have the great opportunity to work and support schools as they grow and develop their programs of inclusion and better understand how to serve their entire population. So today, we're going to really focus on three areas. One, just kind of getting to understand the context of where our schools are and where our teachers are. And then ultimately, what is the what, why, and how of supporting all of our learners? And then how does that help to grow what we already have in place and really further the capacity that we have with all of our teachers? We know that this is a complex system. It's an ecosystem, essentially. And we know that we really have to ensure that our mission and vision are where we start. And often when we choose schools that we're going to work with, we really want to understand, where is the school going and where has it been? We need to understand some of the nuts and bolts and what are the policies and guidelines that exist that help to drive our day-to-day. Who are the students? How have they come into the school? Who are we aiming to have join our school? And in some cases, who have we not been able to accept? And what are some of the professional development opportunities that are necessary for our teachers to feel empowered and to feel confident to serve and support all students? And how we collaborate with one another. And that takes quite a bit because we have to understand each other just as well as the content that we're teaching. Our facilities, our finances, and resources, all of which play into the curriculum which we're going to be serving our students. And we know that data-driven decision making are essential in all the work that we do. And the why. So once we've understood some of the structural and systems pieces, why do we do what we do? The Next Frontier Inclusion is one of the most amazing organizations that I've had the opportunity to be affiliated with and work with. And as they've put it, it's really looking at how international schools can be inclusive and be very deliberate about the decision to support and accept all students. And that's going beyond our learning profiles, but also thinking about the language, the embracing the diversity that exists in all of our demographics and the population that we teach in. And then how do we build on who we already have? How do we ensure that the models that we're building are sustainable? And using structures like universal design that allows access for all to ensure that we really have a high quality educational opportunity for all of our learners. How do we do this? Sometimes we need to take a pause. And sometimes at the beginning of the year is a great time to do that. It's taking that time to say, well, do we all have the same understanding? When we use the terminology, are we coming with the same entry point? Or do we need to come back and revisit that and say, do we have the same commitment and understanding of everything that we do? And then how do we design and make sure that our programs are integrated and working together in a really high functioning way? And then continuing to build that professional capacity, not just with a department, not just with a few who may have a specialization in a particular area for supporting students that may have more complex learning profiles. And then making sure that we all take that time for that evaluation, that time to reflect. Sometimes that's the piece that we end up falling behind in, and just saying, how is it going? Are we doing what we set out to do? So as a collective identity, this is really important because we do come to our working positions and come in with our own identity. We come in as educators, we come in as parents, we come in maybe with a specialist hat. But as a collective, do we share the same values and beliefs around supporting all students? And so as a starting place, that's really one of the key areas that are essential for us to begin. What is our collective identity? How does the mission and vision of our school really guide that? If you're part of leadership, this is really setting that tone so that it doesn't feel like there's just a few that are really trying to kind of push a particular initiative or focus, but as a collective, we agree. And as we come into often these very complex ecosystems that are known as our schools, we come in with our own mental models. These are mindsets, these are experiences, maybe assumptions, or even visions of what I know a program can look like, an approach can look like, a philosophy should be. And so it's really important to understand, what are we bringing together as a very complex team? What are the key components for the institution that we're coming into? And where do we need to challenge that? Where do we need to push that? Or what do we need to further in terms of the work that's already begun? We often think of our schools with many stakeholders. On our daily work, we know that we have our teachers. And as a leader in the school, or as a teacher and thinking about our colleagues, we often look into that and say, well, what are those skills and attitudes that we want to make sure that we have in our colleagues or in the staff that we're recruiting? What are those behaviors that we feel are necessary if we are really saying that we want to develop our inclusive culture? And then if that's there, we're trying to make that shift, what do we need to do to further that? And how do we support that shift or that change and that mindset? Really understanding who our students are. So sometimes this is where we try and move towards, what are those kind of functional systems for what is our admissions policy? How do we admit students? Who are the population of students that we're pulling from? What are those protocols? Do we need to revisit those? When we look at our current population of students, are we oversubscribed? Do we have enough resources to support who we have? And if we're aiming to do more, do we have everything there? And if not, how do we get on that journey to make sure that we have everything? And then how do those transitions look? Not only transitions from the moment that a child enters the school or exits the school, but as they transition through the different divisions and the different parts of the school. And then how do we ensure that that becomes a mutually beneficial experience, that every classroom that a child steps into feels that not only their needs are being met, but they're supporting the needs of their classmate, and that they have this partnership. And our parents, our very, very important parents, how do we make sure that they are able to join that learning community and that they feel that they're part of it? Many times for our students who have more additional learning challenges or complex profiles are really feeling worried, maybe concerned, or new to this journey. And so where do we meet them? How do we make sure that we understand who is part of that community and that they feel that they're learning along with us and that we're gaining all the information that we can from them? And providing those opportunities for parent education where it's needed. Every school, every classroom, we want to make sure that the child is at the center. And that family piece, the parent piece, all of that should be working together in partnership. As a classroom teacher, as a learning support teacher, as a specialist, each of our classrooms may have children who could be experiencing one or two, or maybe even all of these areas of support. We know that we have students that could be really high functioning students who really need that additional talent and enrichment push while also developing their English. maybe developing in other languages. Maybe there's also going to be a counseling component or needing other therapeutic services. And so as a classroom teacher, as I'm trying to navigate all of those pieces and think about all the other kids in my class, how do I do that and feel empowered and supported enough? So as a leader, what does that mean for my classroom teachers? As a classroom teacher, what does that mean for my students as well as for myself? And as a parent, what are some of the things that I can do to provide the information that's needed so that not only my child, but the whole classroom environment is getting the best out of it? We often hear about multi-tiered systems of support. And when we think about it, we often see the triangle approach. And sometimes that, even as a visual, can create a sense that that very, very top tier, where students who really need the most support and typically the most ongoing support are almost inaccessible and really need only very specialist support. But it's really important to understand that although there may be students that need that more intensive individualized support, how do we make sure that we don't hold them there only? And at times, maybe they will go between some of that short-term targeted intervention. And then as we think about that bottom green tier, that high quality differentiated instruction for all students is not just at the bottom for some, but in fact, that is the all-encompassing, including these nested levels where students may fluidly move between them. And so as I think about that as my classroom teaching responsibilities sit, I think about each of those students and what they need, and what is it that I need to know more about so I can support them. And as a leader within the school, how do I really think about how the allocation of each of those tiers is distributed amongst each classroom, across each grade level, and across the school? This universal design for learning goes hand in hand, and it's not only the structural pieces, but really a mindset. How do we view diversity and inclusion? As you hear this presentation today, I encourage you to just take a moment and pause and think about it, maybe even turn and have a discussion with those that you might be watching with, and pose some questions. Do we see the diversity that each of our classrooms may have and the need to have this inclusion as a liability? Do we see this as something that's really going to be pulling away? It's keeping a strain on my classroom? Or do I see it as an asset, an instructional asset full of possibilities and potential? Do I think about how maybe some of the needs of the classroom and the students can distract? Or do I see it as a possibility for all students to improve, not only from a curricular standpoint, but as a whole child? So when you think about this how a little bit deeper, we really want to think about how we can create opportunities that can be included both within the general education classroom, as well as the least restrictive, which sometimes means really creating a safe space where students not just have a pull-out model, but instead thinking about what is it that they need so that they can concentrate, so that they can have all of their needs met, so that they can really focus on maybe very specific or bespoke skills, and then ultimately with that connection to bringing it back to the classroom. We know that sometimes if we lean on only having students excluded, that's not being inclusive. But we also know if students are always learning in the same environment as everybody else, that's also not being inclusive, because now we're not catering in to each of the individualized needs for each child. So consider the differentiated experience for each child, whether that's within a classroom, whether that's in small groups, whether they're flexible groups or clustered groups, and thinking about how we can create those opportunities and understand our students better, and know that we have that permission to do so. We also know for an inclusive classroom, we're including all of our language learners. When we think about our students who are multilingual learners, we also don't want to see them as, well, they're not quite functioning in the language of instruction, so maybe I need to do something less, when in fact, we really want to continue to challenge them appropriately. And so how do we do that? In my time as an educator across multiple schools, one of the tools and resources that we've found to be very helpful is using the Wida Model. The Wida Model is both an assessment as well as a framework that allows us to really think about Where do our students fall in each of these areas of development? And most importantly, looking at it as an asset, as opposed to what are the things that they can't do, what can they do? Because that allows me to have a starting point. And that's really with what they call those can-do descriptors. We also think about the overall global model of student support services. And we know that it starts from the moment that they enter the school and the information that were provided from families, from previous educational settings, to all of the different services that either we as a school can provide or that we need to rely on external resources. And how do we connect all of those so that they're working well together? And that we know that as a child, they're not just going to be one child for the counseling team or for the special needs team or for the English language learning team. But in fact, we have complex beings and we have to really think about them as a whole picture. And how do we as adults come together to work and collaborate with one another to make sure that that child is getting everything they need for all aspects of their learning? And that may mean that we're looking to provide accommodations and modifications. This is often a set of terms that can really come with some confusion or preconceived notions. When we think about a child who needs an accommodation, we're really thinking about working within the current curriculum framework. We're not changing anything, but instead we are adapting, we are leveling it, we're allowing access so that they are starting from a similar point. As an individual who's wearing glasses, we don't want them to start behind and say, well, you can't wear your glasses because it's not fair. Everybody else doesn't have them. It's an accommodation that's going to allow me to start at the same place as my peers. It's the same thing with some of these accommodations where we think it's allowing for extra time for those students who need that time to process. We know that sometimes it's thinking about where they're seated, how they access the materials that they need to support their focus. When we shift over into modifications, that's also a really important shift that we want to make sure that we are serving each child in the way that they need to, that we're not over-servicing and we're not under-servicing. If a child needs to have their curriculum changed, that means that we're not going to assess them against the same criteria. And so sometimes what that has a knock-on effect is that they are going to have a different program as they move through the school, and that's okay. And we just want to make sure that we've worked together with the teachers, that we have enough evidence supporting assessments, as well as worked with the parents and the child so that they understand what each of those steps are. And most importantly, that they don't feel any shame or frustration about having to have this, but instead that they feel a sense of relief and access to do their best. So as you take a pause for a moment, and you think a little bit about what are some of the potential challenges that your school community could face as you start to really have those conversations around becoming more inclusive or acknowledging the population that you already have. And when you think about who's part of that community, what do they need? What are some of maybe the worries, concerns, or possibilities that they would like to see? So I encourage you to take some time and take this question to your team and really think about what are those areas that we need to be mindful of. One activity that you can do, whether you're a school leader, you're doing it in small groups, maybe a department head, what are those barriers that we can surface without any sort of concern or fear, but really just giving everybody a chance to really surface what are those things that they might be thinking about. They may also be able to surface some of the things that have worked for them. And by creating that space, it's really a great opportunity to get the best out of your teams. So it's that engagement in a collaborative inquiry to say we're going to think together, we're going to question together. And once we've done that, we're going to write it down. And we're going to use this as a way to say, not can we do this, but instead, how might we do this? Think about that community through each of those buckets. What do parents need? What are they thinking about? How do we find that information out? What do teachers need? And ultimately, our focus, what do our students need? And we use that data that we can collect and we connect it with the relationships that we have. So taking that hard and soft and being able to say, how do we really triangulate the data that we've just collected to really construct a better understanding of where we are and where we'd like to go with all stakeholders? And as we plan for the success, we take this collective data, we make sure that we think about targeted intervention, both at the micro level and thinking about it for individual students, but even as a school team. What's the most impactful behavior that we are hoping to address? And then how does that carry over as we generalize it into a classroom setting? And as we circle back with that same concept of universal design for learning, we know that there are 3 guidelines, 3 key areas, and it's that engagement. We think about it at a classroom level and with our students, but also at a school level. We want to optimize choice and autonomy with our teachers as well as with our students. We want to make it authentic and relevant, so understanding what is the work that they put in every day to get all of that information that's going to help guide us. And how do we minimize those threats or distractions or fears that could stop us from moving forward on this journey? How do we represent this information in a way that is going to be enticing and understanding? And we know in this digital world that we live in, sometimes we can get very consistent in the way that we present things, but really make sure that it makes the best out of that multi-sensory approach. So if you're working with teaching teams, really allowing everybody as adults to engage in different ways in conversations, allowing visuals, the same way that we would for our students. And that allows us to really think, do we have a shared language and a shared understanding? And if not, how do we get there? And lastly, our action and expression. How do we allow both our children in the classroom and creating this differentiated experience in classroom environment for them to feel safe in expressing themselves and making sure that we're not assessing the wrong thing by saying, well, I want this information, but it doesn't actually matter how you give it to me because I just want to know if you understand it. For teachers to be able to explore and have that inquiry experience just as students do, to be able to present and share this information back, and to have that open line of communication throughout the school with one another, with leadership, with our families, and with our students. And that constructed or shared cognition that we then engage in allows us to move together and then allows that facilitation for those opportunities to come and really work toward the goals. So as you think about adaptive change, these are some of the questions that you can take away. Change sometimes allows us to think that we're losing something, but in fact, we can be gaining other things. So really face that head on. What is over as we start to make shifts? And what are the things that are not? What are the things that we value that we really want to make sure we keep? We know during COVID, we had to change quite a bit of things, but we know that we gained other tools and skills. And there are certain things that as we start to return to some of our ways of work that we don't want to lose. And how do we support ourselves through this change? We talk about self-care often, but it really is important as each member of this learning community to think about, what do I need in order to do the best work? And then how do I advocate for that amongst my team members, amongst my colleagues, amongst my leadership team? And so take some of these away, allow yourself that permission to be creative, and also think about managing the chaos and anticipating that it's not always going to go smoothly and that we're not in a race, but in fact, it's a bit of a marathon, and we take our time and we acknowledge where we are and we reflect on it and tweak as we go. Please feel free to share any questions with me, whether it's in the chat or contacting me at a later time. I hope this information was useful to you, and I encourage you all to please stay connected or get connected. My information is here and available to you. Thank you again, and thank you, Middle East Educational Leadership and Conference, Teaching and Learning Conference.